So our next sacrament of commitment is holy orders. I like to think when I'm trying to be humble, but I can't. You know how prideful I can be. That I'm one of really a few that has the opportunity to actually have received all 7 sacraments. Most of us do not. Because as a deacon, you can be married before you become a deacon, and therefore you can receive all 7 sacraments in that respect. But most clergy does not do that. They get the sacrament of ordination, and then along with that comes a vow of chastity, so they do not get married. And in fact, as a deacon, if my wife were to pass, I cannot remarry. So I have that same vow in that regard. So anyhow, we are all called to serve as laity and as clergy. And here we go, right back to the beginning again. So when you start asking about the sacrament of ordination, you should ask about, well, where did this all begin? And so in the world we live in today, we have the laity, we have clergy, and we have the religious. And so when we're baptized, one of the blessings that we give those who are baptized is that we baptize them as priest, prophet, and king, and we make the sign of the cross and then a little circle for the crown. So priest, prophet, and king, and those each stand for a different aspect of our discipleship. So priest is often thought of as the leader of our worship service, as was Jesus. He would call people together and give praise and serve them in that regard. Evangelization is often associated with prophets. So all those Old Testament prophets would come and spread the word, spread God's word, or be a conduit to tell the people what God wanted from them. And so are we called to do spread the good news. And then king we equate with leadership. So Jesus was also the leader, but he was a leader who served the people, not a leader who put the people down. So all those aspects we are called to as we are baptized. But today we're focusing on the clergy. And if you want to look at the, this is awful small print. If we want to look at, within the Catholic Church, the clergy is probably more complicated than any other religion. We have at the top of the hierarchy, of course, Pope Francis, who is recognized as the successor of Peter. So Peter was first among the apostles. The Lord handed him the keys to heaven, said he's the rock we're going to build our church on. And so he got up on Monday morning and everybody started calling him Pope Peter. In fact, the title Pope probably didn't come along until about 300 or 400 years after the death and resurrection of the Lord. But the Catholic Church can go back through their records and trace that, okay, so-and-so was a follower of so-and-so, and this guy was a follower, and he was the primary evangelizer of his day, and so we feel we can trace that back to Peter. And what that implies, I guess, is that an entrustment of the faith to an individual who can be put in a position that they can pronounce for the church what the faith means in certain circumstances. Does that mean that they are totally isolated and should act as a king? Only in terms of, are they serving the people? And so if you go through the history of the church, which, have you gone through the history? Not yet.
Yeah, Mike took us, but we only got part way.
Okay. But as you go through the history of the church, you'll find there were some pretty bad popes. In fact, popes became more like political leaders than religious leaders, and that was a damn shame, because that they were leading people in that direction to damnation. But we are blessed, I think, in the last century or two to have had, and during that time, all since the beginning, we've had some very, very good folks. So they're men just like everybody else, and they make their mistakes, but some of them were really pretty bad. So one of the things that means in today's day and age is that the Pope will make pronouncements or write letters or give his opinion on different things. And so he speaks for the Catholic Church, and that's the way we want things to be. And so as opposed to other churches, we're trying to avoid all this splintering that has taken place, which is a great failing of the Christian faith, that we have all this splintering that goes because different people think they know what God wants, and it's different from what somebody else wants, and so instead of fighting over it, they just leave and form another church. So we have a lot more cohesion in that regard in the Catholic Church in terms of our hierarchy. So in the early days, we had the apostles, and they were the first ones to go out and proclaim the faith. And so today, we would look at them as bishops, 12 bishops that went out and spread the faith, and Peter was the head of the bishops, or we would equate that to the Pope. So those bishops, you remember some of the early writings, Acts of the Apostles, where these guys got pretty busy. They were doing miracles, and so people were flocking to them. Philip, in one day, I think that he converted hundreds of people in one day, and they baptized them all. I mean, just try to put yourself in that. You know, if you're getting a little complacent in your faith, just put yourself into that day, and just how exciting that had to be. That, oh my God, you know, there is a heaven, and there's a place for me in heaven, and there was a man named Jesus that brought it to us, and he was actually God's son. And so they get very excited, and then they were just swamping. And if you think we have difficulties today, those people, I mean, they were just barely trying to survive most times, just day to day. So they were fired up, and then in the process, you got a crowd of 5,000 people. Some of them perhaps wealthy, some of them at least making a living, but many of them widows and orphans that couldn't hardly take care of themselves. They were starving, literally. And so the apostles in their wisdom saw that, and they said, we need some help here. We can take care of this business of spreading the word, but we just need some practical help here. So they instigated the ordination or the appointment of deacons. That's where deacons came from. We're the really kind of more ancient than the priests. At that time, there were no priests. It was either you were one of the apostles or you were a deacon. And the job of the deacon was to serve, but on a practical standpoint, to serve the widows and the orphans and make sure they were getting taken care of. And so social justice, which I'll talk about a little bit more in the future, really was in the realm of those deacons.
And for those of us from Protestant backgrounds, I know I grew up in a church where there were deacons. Were there deacons in your churches too? Mm-hmm. Yeah. And it tended to be things in the church that needed to be taken care of, and that more of that practical stuff too.
So over time, as the church grew, then the bishops decided that they could not even fulfill their spiritual duties. It's just too many people, too many places to go to, and so they started appointing or ordaining priests. And then that was a rapid expansion. Lots of priests were ordained, and they went out and really, in many cases, stood in place of the bishop. And over time, that grew so much that the use of the deacons, the priests really took over most of the duties, or the duties of the deacons. So the deacons eventually had disappeared by the 20th century. There weren't deacons anymore. Just to go back up a second. So all clergy have these duties: to teach, to baptize, to witness marriage, and to officiate at funerals, and that includes deacons. Priests and bishops consecrate the Eucharist. They reconcile or do confession. They can confirm. They can anoint the sick and give holy or the anointing. They do the anointing of the sick. And then the bishops still retain the responsibility of holy orders or ordaining new clergy. The Pope himself has many titles, but the bottom line is he is elected. Essentially, he's elected by a group of cardinals. And as he makes pronouncements, in this day and age, we'll get to this in a minute, but there are tons of committees and commissions and so forth that advise the Pope. So he doesn't just pull things out of the air. He has to think, pray, and talk to a lot of the people around him. And different popes have taken different initiatives as part of that, and some of them have been much more, let's just say, willing to interact with the world as they find it. And so, like John Paul II was faced with the world of communism, and so he really took that head on. John the 23rd was faced with a world that was changing so dramatically. He took that on. And Francis, among other things, I think has taken us back to a more pastoral church, very similar maybe to what those first apostles were out there preaching. So they set the tone, but they'd get a lot of advice from other people. So it's not like the Pope is just this unilateral person that makes all these decisions.
It's probably a good thing if you would talk about what it means to be infallible as
Right,
well.
because they talk about the infallibility of the Pope. And there's a couple distinctions there. One is when the Pope speaks on an infallible matter, he makes this pronouncement. And so the one and only pronouncement that he's made and that they considered infallible was on Mary's mother, that she was immaculate conception. She was conceived without sin. Mary's mother, not Mary, that's assumed, but Mary's mother. And that's the only time that he's done that. Does that mean there's only the teachings of the church, there's only one infallible teaching? No. There are other things. Everything in the creed, for instance, is considered infallible. It's just assumed that it's infallible. You can't change the creed. The virginity of Mary is considered infallible teaching, but it does not need none of those things need a pronouncement from the Pope. There are many other things that the Pope makes clear to people. So his teachings on I'm trying to think of something. Probably the pro-life stance of the church. He would also consider, the church would also consider infallible, but just as in a different way than some of those other things. But the Pope will make pronouncements on that. That is not, he's not usually speaking infallibly, but he is speaking on infallible facts. And so the sacredness of human life, the sacredness and the dignity of human life, that's what's behind his words. He may have different takes on it. When it comes to reproduction in that area, the world keeps coming up with new ways of assisting or preventing children being born. And so he has to keep up with that so he can say, yes, that's still falling under the sacredness of life or not. And so it's a living, breathing, current relationship that the Pope has with his people. And in saying that, that's why he often makes the headlines, right? So, and that's a good thing that he's out there. In addition to the bishops and the priests, we also have cardinals. They are also appointed by the Pope, and their realm oftentimes includes more than a diocese. So a bishop or an archbishop, I'm not going to get into all those details, but they are in charge of a diocese, and an archbishop may be in charge of more than one diocese, but a cardinal usually is in charge of a designated geographic area of some sort. Like there's a cardinal that is located in Chicago, Boston, New York City, big centers of population. There are usually cardinals that represent that area, and they serve they serve where they're appointed to, but on certain matters they might be called to Rome, and especially if they're electing a new pope, they would be called to Rome. One of the good things about the modern church is there are cardinals from all over the world, and the bishop or the popes have been wise in appointing them all over the world, and so the church isn't dominated so much now by the world of Rome and Italy. In the past, almost every cardinal was from Rome, and we never had a non-Italian pope. Guess why? Because they were all being appointed by cardinals that lived in Rome or were near Rome. And so let's get back to the deacons, of course. Nothing more important than the deacons. So the deacons were kind of forgotten for a long time, and then I believe it was right around Vatican II, they started looking at that again, and so they reinstituted the deacons, and I would say, you know, I became a deacon 11 years ago, and I would say that ever since '63 or '60 in the '60s. They're still trying to figure out in a way what do we do with these deacons. And so as I went through classes 11 years ago, many of us often pondered, you know, when we were assigned to a parish, what's the priest they're going to have us doing. And at that time, there were a number of parish priests that were like, I don't need a deacon. What do I want a deacon for? And so it became difficult for those guys breaking that ground. But today I think most pastors are welcoming them, partly because of the priest shortage. We're not priests, but there are things we can do, like help with baptisms, funerals, some of the more serving kind of positions that are available in the parish. And so I think most priests will find that very helpful. I remember many a time Father Mark would come to me and say, can you help me out? I have 4 funerals next week, and one of the internments is out in North Baltimore, and he says, could you make that one for me? And so I would, you know, I'd help you with the funeral, and then I'd go to the cemetery. Glad to do it, because sometimes he looks so tired.
I bet you're going to do it this week, too.
And this week maybe the same. Yeah, we have 3 funerals this week. So deacons have become, as I mentioned earlier, you know, we have certain duties, but I think we've become more valuable. But in the same sense, we're struggling as deacons too, because we are looking usually for young men to middle-aged men that are willing to serve, and when people, you know, when guys are in their 30s, oftentimes they're very busy with their family life and their careers, and so to take on the training and the process to become a deacon can be a real challenge. And so I think it's 35 or something like that is the minimum age. So probably the ideal time for a person to think about becoming a deacon would be in their late 40s, maybe into their 50s. I became a deacon rather late in life. So I was 50 when I kind of began the process and didn't really get serious until about 10 years later.
What did you have to do?
I went to classes every other week for 3 years, Most of them were at the diocese. Some of them were in Findlay. We did Bible study. We did theology studies. Very similar curriculum to what the priests are called to do. And then there's a period of discernment where you're evaluated. My class started with 7 guys. We ended up with 4. 1 dropped on their own. 2 of them were asked to leave. It just didn't seem to be suited to what they were being called to do. And so it's a lot, for me it was just a lot of process of discernment. First of all, should I do this or not? Am I worthy to do this? Obviously I felt I wasn't. No, not really. People around me, I think I listened to people around me more than anything that said, you know, you could do this. And then of course you listen to what hopefully God is calling you to do. But as I say, I was not, Phil, be my deacon. I didn't hear that, you know, that kind of thing.
Yeah. Would have been easier, huh?
Yes, it would have. So just a gradual, and then your wife, if you're married, has to definitely give her permission. Because you already made one vow, guys, so you know, are you going to make this other one? And they tell you as a deacon, if you're married, that you're still, your primary vow is to your wife. And so once in a while there would be a conflict between what I was being asked to do and what my family needs might be, and sometimes you kind of have to balance those and think about them, but I always still give priority to the family. So anyhow, deacons are still kind of working their way through, and but we need deacons just like we need priests. In fact, in 5 years, your deacon here will be in retirement. So we're looking for good men. So this is some of the things that you do more formally have to do. You have formation and discernment. And then the bishop, whether you're a priest or deacon, he calls you to order. So you go and you have an interview with the bishop. And your wife comes with you as a deacon. Your wife comes with you, and they kind of scrutinize you. Well, it was Bishop Blair at the time, and it was not as terrifying as I thought it was going to be, so it was okay. And then at the actual ordination, there's a promise of obedience. So has anybody here ever been to an ordination? So the guys all come in and prostrate themselves before the altar. I mean prostrate. And so you're already showing your faithfulness and obedience to the bishop. The bishop will lay hands on the candidate, called on the Holy Spirit, and then depending on priest or deacon, he will bestow upon them the symbols of their ministry. So the Eucharist, they'll get a chalice, and the priest will get a chalice and a ciborium. They each receive the gospel. So deacons, that's one of the primary duties of the deacon, is to preach, which I will be doing next weekend, by the way. So I warn you that if you want to find another place to go to Mass. And then at the ceremony, there's exchange of the sign of peace. And that's all within the context of a Mass. So it's quite beautiful. Very moving. So that's the formal part of it. So just to go over maybe some of the things that come up amongst people about the clergy. We view that the relationship between Jesus and his church is similar to the relationship between a bridegroom and his bride. And so in that respect, the whole idea of celibacy is that as a priest becomes ordained, the church is really his bride. That is where all his energy is going. And so, and from a practical standpoint, I would say that it has great benefits and also great challenges. So they are called to be father to everyone, not just, a family. And so in many respects, not having children of their biological selves frees them to emotionally be available to broader. But sometimes you can view it as they also then sort of deny themselves the comfort of a wife and children at the end of the day. They're on 24/7, so it's a real challenge for them. But many of the priests will tell you that choosing this is the better part, because that your relationship with God and the promises that await you are so much far beyond the happiness we can enjoy here on this earth. Even the joy of marriage, or all the sacrifices, or all the sacraments. I mean, when we get to heaven, there won't be sacraments anymore. We won't need them anymore, because those sacraments are all bent on getting us to heaven, but once we're there, we won't need them anymore. And so the priest is in kind of a special place that he can commit to that 24/7. And then there are also other duties, calling down the Holy Spirit in the sacraments. And I think, I've seen this in all priests, but I think Father Mark embodied that. When he did the sacrament of the healing of the sick, I just felt like the Spirit. I could feel the Spirit coming down through him and to those people. And so, and I think Father Tom has that same aura about him, that when he does a liturgy, he's focused on that liturgy, and he's really calling down the Spirit to be with us in a special way. And then they preach, and I've heard this pronounced by one of the teachers I had when I was in formation, that the priest is here to testify to the Word, and the Word is Christ crucified, Christ resurrected, Christ crucified, Christ risen. And that's the promise that as Christians we look forward to, that he died for us, he rose for us, and we will join him in that journey. I'm not going to spend much time here, but I just, it's kind of, if you are confused about all the different orders of clergy and religious, then welcome to the club, because most of us are. I was raised in a non-Catholic community, and so the only real exposure I had to this is when we got a priest, we didn't think much about what order he belonged to. And we did have sisters that came in to teach us our catechism. Ours were from the Sisters of Notre Dame, but I didn't even know that until I got to be an adult. They were just the penguins, you know. So it's just there for what it's worth. There are, like Augustinians and Benedictines, orders are almost always formed by a saint back in the past. They weren't saints when they formed the orders, but so there are Franciscans, and St. Francis, he had his followers and he emphasized certain parts of the faith, and so those followers, historically, St. Francis was very close to nature and elemental and the poor, and so the Franciscans and the Poor Clares are two orders, one of religious, one of clergy, that kind of underlying their mission, their ministry is that. And so if you go to a Franciscan retreat center, you're going to see a lot of beautiful nature usually. And Dominicans, St. Dominic was a great preacher, and so Dominicans are known for their preaching abilities. That doesn't mean nobody else has them, it just means that's an area that they've devoted themselves to. Jesuits are fairly common in this area, and they were real missionaries. They went to this country early on, and many of them became martyrs because of the areas they went into. And so now today they're looked at a bit like as radical priests, that they do a lot of the teaching. They have strong opinions. I'm generalizing here, of course, but noted for, I think, for their intellectualism as well. So St. John's is a Jesuit educational facility. So those are just some, there's many of them. And there are monks and friars, and when you look at the religious community, sometimes you kind of divide it into members of the some members of the religious community, I believe, are priests as well as part of that religious, like in the monks, there may be ordained monks. But for the other separation, it really becomes, are they engaged with the world, are they in cloister, which means they're praying for the world, but they are not part of the world. That has become rarer and rarer in our world. Most of the nuns, I think, have found that in order to sustain their ministry, they have to get out there. So hospitals, educational institutions, many of them were founded by orders of nuns and sisters. But find a good book and you can learn all about this. Go down to Cary, I think. If you go to Cary, they've got a little space down there in their basement where they have cases with a different garb of the different, I've been somewhere else too where they have, you kind of walk through, I'm trying to remember where that is, where they have, you walk through and there's like all the different orders of the costume of all the different orders. Some of them are pretty wild. And then finally, I'll just take a few minutes here to talk at the end about the Roman Curia, which is, this is the nuts and bolts part of the Catholic administration. So it's pretty much all located centrally in Rome, although it's spread out throughout the world, but the central office, so to speak, is in Rome. And so this is where they have all these, there's Secretary of the State of Economy and Communication, they're exactly what they sound like. Doctrine of the Faith, Oriental churches, these are congregations. Divine worship and the discipline of the sacraments. So let's just say they want to revise the missal we use at Mass. That would probably be the congregation that starts to work on that. Causes of saints, so the saint's going to be not ordained, but canonized. That would be the group that kind of organizes that and puts it together. Congregation of Catholic Education, seminaries. So that is organized in an office. Congregation for bishops. And then there are tribunals, the Apostolic Penitentiary, which is not exactly what it sounds like. But I have to admit, I can't remember exactly what that is. But the one tribunal that we are most familiar with is the Tribunal of the Rota Romana, which is a group that deals with annulments. We talk all about annulments. I didn't mention the time frame. Most of the annulments in our diocese are usually completed in 3 to 6 months, I would say. If it ends up going to Rome, which is this body here, then you're looking at least a year. And why does it go to Rome? Probably because the local tribunal ruled against, and then so they're appealing it to Rome. And here are, these are called consuls. So again, they're usually self-explanatory for the laity, promoting Christian unity, family, justice and peace, migrants and itinerants, healthcare workers, legislative texts, religious dialogue, culture, social communications, new evangelization, all very much directed towards specific issues that come into the world. And somewhere here, You know, these are financial offices. So one of the scandals of the church, which maybe has not been as publicized as the sexual scandals of the church, but one of the scandals of the church was that there's always been some rumors of financial malfeasance in Rome. And those three different groups there deal with the financial matters of the church, which is, you know, the church has a lot of assets, obviously, and many of the assets are, they're not liquid, they're property owned and artworks owned and things like that that can be kind of problematic in trying to figure out where they're at and if they're gonna, if there's a need somewhere, where do they get the money from and so forth. This kind of brings up the idea, a non-spiritual discussion that I've heard about why don't priests get married, because in the Middle Ages priests were getting married and then they got into all kinds of political issues because the priest would have, as a married person would have property that he accumulates. And so at the end then we have the church arguing with the family over whose property is that? Is it their property or is it the church's property? And so from a practical standpoint, I think that had something to do with the end of married priests, but it sounds a little cynical really, but that's the way it is. And then there were these commissions that you see listed there. I wanted to just point out this one. Academies, the pontifical academies, life ethic and bioethics, sciences, social sciences, training of the priest for the curia. But those other ones, they have these institutions that deal with science and biology and all of that. So when the priest, when the Pope is thinking of making a pronouncement on some new scientific discovery that has impact on reproduction, let us say, then he doesn't, like I said, he gets consultants, but they're not always, in fact, most times they're not necessarily other clergy. He goes out and finds people around the world, and even Stephen Hawkins, who was acknowledged as an atheist, I believe, he would ask Stephen Hawkins about this, explain this theory to me so I could better understand it. And so he could put it in the context of the faith. And so many, many scientists are consulted, and so that they have the facts before any decision is made. So I think that's kind of cool that the Pope has that direct connection to the real world, but for the spiritual purposes of the people. So that's the history of the clergy in a 5-minute condensation. But questions? You are in the seminary, right?
No, my brother is.
Oh, I got the wrong brother.
Yeah. He went back Friday.
How has his experience been?
He's loving it so far. Right now he's just in the college.
He's discerning.
Yeah, so he hasn't gotten to the theological part of it yet. But so far he's really loved it.
So he will graduate college, and at
Yes.
that time, if he
And then
decides
he'll go
to,
into
he
the
will
theological,
consider.
yep.
These are decisions that guys and women make, over a long period of.
So he's
pondering.
looking at 4 years of the college and then another 5 years in the theological department. So he has like 9 years before he actually takes orders, if that's what he decides. So again, it's not just like a snap decision.
Yeah.
It's a long process. And,
Sure.
A commitment.
yes.
And on that, I'll conclude.
Thanks very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.